Hello and welcome, What the Finances, to another episode of the What the Finance Podcast, where we talk to experts to help gain a greater understanding about what is happening in the world of finance, investing, and markets. On today's podcast, I'm happy to welcome back Doomberg, who doesn't need any introduction, but has basically become an expert in the energy and electricity field. So thanks for joining the podcast today.
Hey, Anthony, great to be back, and congratulations on the growth of your channel. We were just chatting before you hit record, and it's fun to watch, and really enjoyed my last appearance and looking forward to another great discussion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was saying probably wasn't hard enough on you the first time because you've come back. So maybe we'll have to ask the tough questions and could go from there. But yeah, I guess my first question, maybe for anyone who hasn't really been paying attention to the energy markets, which, is quite hard to do at the moment, but can you just give a quick overview in your opinion on really what's happening around the world?
Yeah, so I think the headline is Europe has gambled on the weather and so far has won, much to the relief of our many European friends and subscribers, and we're quite pleased by that, of course, which means that the crisis of European energy has abated at least temporarily because of the unusually warm November that they are blessed to have been experiencing. Let's hope it keeps up. The jokes kind of write themselves. Europe's saved by global warming. But nonetheless, the price of natural gas is off the highs. Electricity in Europe is off the highs. Still quite elevated. 1 month contract for LNG to Europe and Asia today, as we're recording this, is in the $30 per million BTU range, which is still roughly $180 a barrel of oil equivalent. It's not cheap, but it's not. It was 3 times the price at the apex of the crisis, and we shall see. A cold dash of a hard winter in December a cold snap in December could really change the game. Let's hope it doesn't happen. But also, let's hope that Europe has learned its lesson and doesn't find itself in this position again anytime soon. The worst outcome would be Europe barely skates by and learns nothing. That would be a real tragedy. Moving to North America, oil prices are still very elevated despite Joe Biden's desperate attempt to jawbone them down ahead of the midterms, which thankfully are only 10 days away now, because I'm getting sick and tired of all the text messages and commercials and emails. But hopefully the midterms come and go without major incident. But price of oil, as we're talking, is back up to around $90 a barrel, much to the frustration of the Biden administration. I think we've written a couple of pieces since we last talked about the rating of the strategic petroleum reserves for political purposes and the dangerous precedent that sets, and the likely consequences when OPEC truly has all the cards, which is going to happen here pretty soon. But on the flip side, we're starting to see some economic struggles. China's still the big black box, with the permanent ascension of Xi to the throne of a ruler for life, and the complete takeover of the Chinese Communist Party, which is kind of scary and unprecedented. Who knows what that's going to mean for the Chinese economy or for the ultimate, black swan of an invasion of Taiwan. Seems like we've got some negative momentum over there. But overall, energy markets, not as bad as they were, still a lot of tension and still a significant need for the West to produce more of its own.
Yeah, as you said, it's. I was laughing when you were saying about whether Europe will learn their lesson, and that includes the UK, because unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. I guess if we sort of go to what the UK and Europe have done, what the governments have done, many of the initiatives that they've brought in, such as sort of capping electricity prices for at least private citizens, energy subsidies, all these things, they seem very short-sighted, and they don't really have any impact on supply or demand, which is really the concern. So I guess, in your opinion, you mentioned there, if it's a bad winter, then it could end very badly. But what's your opinion on sort of how this ends?
So there's not just this winter, of course, there's next winter as well. And much of the natural gas that's currently in storage came via pipeline from Russia, and that pipeline no longer exists, unfortunately, with the sabotaging of Nord Stream, which again has transpired since our last appearance on our show. And, the new prime minister in the UK reinstituting a ban on fracking doesn't inspire much confidence in the fossil fuels industry about the seriousness of the European leadership and whether they have learned anything at all, really, from this episode. And also, of course, the amazing return to coal especially in places like Germany, who until this year were prided themselves on the greenification of their electricity grid. Although to the Chancellor of Germany's credit, they have extended the life of those 3 nuclear power plants, which was a decision we applaud. In theory, it's extended until April, but that'll be extended indefinitely in our view. If it makes no sense to close them down now, it's going to make a lot less sense as the continent gets ready to face yet another winter, this time with much less Russian natural gas. I think much of the scenario analysis on a go-forward basis, of course, depends on if there's a resolution in the war in Ukraine and what that resolution looks like. And that's really just very difficult for analysts to model. So, if peace broke out tomorrow and Putin was magically replaced with a Western-oriented enlightened leader, and the molecules could flow with abandon, you would see energy prices collapse by 60, 70% overnight. And that would be the correct market interpretation of events. The odds of that happening seem pretty low. One wonders if Putin were to somehow lose his grip on power, who would replace him, and whether it might not be worse. Impossible to say. And so, much remains to be decided. But again, as we started this podcast, the weather in Europe has been good, which is a blessing. And let's hope it holds out.
Yeah, definitely. That's vital to think. So I recently talked to someone who's sort of an expert in, I think he runs an energy hedge fund, Alexander Starhill, and he was talking about the challenges experienced in Europe due to sort of French nuclear plants going down, obviously droughts throughout Europe, which has had an impact on nuclear, but also hydropower sort of in Scandinavia and those regions, which are normally net exporters of electricity. So I guess my opinion, only a month ago there was that concern, but now you mentioned gas prices have come down. I think I saw somewhere that in some ports and in some countries, gas was almost negative because there's just not the need for it because we've got quite a warm early or late autumn, early spring, early winter. So I guess, is this just doomism living up to the name? No, this is because I'm sure lots of people are going to say, oh, this isn't going to happen, the crisis. But...
Sure. And if that's the takeaway from this, then they're just postponing a reckoning, of course, right?
Yeah.
Now let's talk about natural gas for a second, because I've seen that out there, and lots of trolls on Twitter littering our feed with it. The negative number you quote, which is hour ahead Dutch TTF contracts, of course. So natural gas is highly inelastic, which is why it can trade for pennies per million BTU in some parts of the world and $100 per million BTU at the peak of the crisis in Europe. So what's happening is Europe, incorrectly, from its perspective at least, sought to acquire every single molecule of natural gas it could get its hands on, almost regardless of the price. And a global flotilla of liquefied natural gas carriers arrived because they paid the higher price. And but there's bottlenecks, and these bottlenecks can create local gluts. So they filled their storage tanks and integrated across Europe. Europe is capable of storing roughly 23%, let's say, of their annual natural gas needs. Those tanks are pretty much full. And on top of that, the capacity to degasify liquefied natural gas, regasify liquefied natural gas and convert it back into the standard form in which it is used and spread around the continent via pipeline. There's an insufficient amount of that import capacity. A lot of it is concentrated in Spain. And then from Spain to the rest of Europe, there is a bottleneck of pipelines. And so even though Spain has a lot of capacity to import LNG, it was never designed. Well, let's put it this way. The balance of the pipeline system within Spain was never designed to operate with 100% capacity on the LNG import terminals that they have. And so you end up with local gluts. And so, yes, there was a flotilla of LNG carriers that could not offload their material. And so on a very short-term basis in localized areas, the price of natural gas went negative. In the month ahead contract and in the forward contracts, the price of natural gas was always above $30 per million BTU. The same situation is unfolding in the United States today because, again, of a lack of pipeline. In the US, the lack of pipelines are because of environmental lawsuits and nuisance lawsuits and protests and politics around doing all they can do to delay permitting for such pipelines. And so there's a region in West Texas where natural gas is produced associated with production of oil, so it's called associated gas, and there's a desperate need for oil and diesel and gasoline and refining in the United States, and so they're producing as much oil as they can, and the pipeline network is getting quite full. And one of the major pipelines that connects this region to, say, Mexico and to the Gulf Coast was down for maintenance for a couple of days. And so during those days, the price of natural gas went negative at the Waha hub, WAHA, for those who have a Bloomberg terminal and they want to look it up. So we quote the price of natural gas in the US as Henry Hub by convention, but there's dozens of hubs where natural gas trades hands and prices are quoted. And in some of those hubs where the production of oil means production of excess associated gas means there's no pipeline offtake, and in some cases they have to flare it because the value of the oil makes the burning of natural gas the most economic decision. Unfortunately, it's a bad one for the environment, and that's one of the major reasons why we should have a healthy, vibrant pipeline network across the United States, and in most cases we do. But in such circumstances where because of the difficulty in handling natural gas, prices can go negative, and they can also go to $1,000 per million BTU. During the big Texas freeze, some of these same hubs saw the price of natural gas go to $2,000 per million BTU. Like, it's crazy. But that's the day ahead and next day ahead price, and they desperately needed it, or else they would have shut down the grid. And so in that moment, that natural gas was worth it to the people who were acquiring it at that price. So all the way back to the beginning, these LNG carriers who are floating off the coast of Spain are basically floating storage for Europe and are charging a pretty penny for it. And so ultimately, the quote price of natural gas that is going to be paid is much higher than the quoted hour ahead Dutch TTF contract, which is fine, and we understand the trolls, and no matter how many times we say we want to be wrong and we're the first to hope that we're being alarmist, people are still, Twitter being what it is, happy to point out where they think you might have been wrong, which is fine. But if you look at the daily storage rates being charged on these LNG carriers, I mean, that money is coming out of the pockets of somebody. And ultimately, it's going to find its way to the price of electricity in Europe. So yeah, it is what it is. There's all kinds of nuances in the market, and Twitter is, filled with people willing to take very narrow slices and draw very large conclusions. And when you know actually what's going on, you can't spend your time swatting at flies like that. You have to sort of think big picture and see what it really means for the market. And ultimately, the big picture conclusion is it's warm in Europe. Great.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And from my understanding, the real issue with what we're experiencing isn't that, obviously there is a supply shortage due to cut off of other supply, but it's actually getting it to where it's needed, getting that energy to where it's needed. I think I've seen there's a picture going around in the US about all the pipelines, and it's almost like a spider web in some states, but I think it's New England where there's only one or two pipelines actually going in. And you could say it's similar in parts of Germany, like some very heavy industrial parts of Germany that used to be reliant on coal or nuclear. And if that's gone down, if there are those bottlenecks, that's where the real issues occur.
So funny. That's our chart. We made
that's your chart. Yeah. Okay.
We made that chart in a piece we wrote last year called New England is an Energy Crisis Waiting to Happen. And then we sort of repackaged that piece into an updated thread a couple of weeks ago, and that thread went pretty viral. And so, yeah, it's a chart of the U.S. pipeline network. And I drew a box around New England where there's none. And I drew a box around, Pennsylvania and so the Appalachia region, where there's, literally you can't see the land under it, and because there's so many pipelines. And under the New England box, we wrote problem, and over the Pennsylvania box, we wrote solution. And nice, simple, visual, crisp. It really does lay bare the problem. And New England is paying global LNG prices today for its natural gas, and we put a tweet out with that same chart over the weekend that kind of did well, a couple of thousand likes, I think. And we said, look, if there's an energy crisis in New England, let's not kid ourselves. New England is running the European energy playbook, shutting down nukes, resisting natural gas pipelines, loading their grid with intermittent renewables, and praying for a mild winter. And by the way, may they have it. We're not hoping for a New England energy crisis. We would like for the leaders of New England to get their heads on straight and to serve their citizens a bit more responsibly. We don't live in New England, so ultimately, as we said in the tweet, the rest of the U.S. will be just fine. In our part of the world where we live in the U.S., there's plenty of pipelines and plenty of storage, and winters are tough, but they're also fun because when you adjust the thermostat, the house gets warmer. Because we've thought through this over here in the rest of the world. We're not so silly as to assume that unicorns and rainbows will power our homes.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes people they almost see it should be all right, but then they don't understand the complexity that goes on behind actually, getting energy and heat to someone's home, which is really interesting. So you mentioned that next year could actually potentially be worse. So I guess why, especially in Europe? So why is that?
Maybe just look at the the primary reason is the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, because this removes significant optionality from Europe. It removes motivation for either side to come to a reasonable peace agreement. Because it's sort of a carrot to Putin is, we reopen the energy flows. If you get yourself right in Ukraine, that's gone. And so what motivation does Putin have now necessarily to come to a reasonable agreement? It's just bad. So, this is a huge part of the European energy mix that's been taken off the table. It's just that simple. And the build out of LNG export facilities around the world and import facilities in Europe won't be complete by next winter. And so more and more of Europe's gas will have to come from LNG. The speed with which they can build excess storage remains to be seen. And so we wrote a piece about the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. And it saddened us, to be honest with you, because we know that it condemns Europe to a much harder couple of years than was perhaps necessary. We understand that war is brutal and such things happen. And but the piece we wrote, by the way, was called Decades in Minutes. And the destruction of those pipelines, which occurred in minutes, will have consequences that range for decades. And so Russia will turn its attention to China, and we'll see how quick Russia and China could build pipelines. I could assure you that the environmental nuisance lawsuits aren't a barrier to the Chinese and the Russians as they reorient the critical energy arteries that power the world. And Europe will have to have a plan. We don't yet see the level of seriousness among the European leadership that would indicate a high likelihood that, absent praying for warm winters, they have a significant plan that goes beyond that.
Yeah, which is for me as someone who's based in the UK, and obviously the connection to Europe is very concerning. So if we were to talk to some leaders or potentially some of the protesters that we've seen throwing food and soup and mashed potatoes at paintings just randomly, they would probably blame energy companies, and they would say that they're war profiteering and that they're making a fortune. And we've seen, a few companies have actually released earnings and they've been doing quite well. So I guess if you were to talk to any of them sitting in the room, and if it were civil, which it probably wouldn't be, but how would you explain to them why these companies are making money and why it's not war profiteering?
Again, there's this concept in the commodity sector of pinch points. So let's take refining in the United States. There's no shortage of oil because Biden is draining the strategic petroleum reserve. We haven't built a new refinery in the United States since the 1970s. Shocks people when, like a new major one. There's been a few small ones here and there. The refining capacity in the United States has gone down. And then the oil that those refineries can actually refine, so we're oriented towards Venezuelan heavy and Canadian heavy oil. And the oil being produced in the shale patch is actually lighter and sweeter grade, and not really optimized for the existing refining fleet in the United States. And so now you have this situation where refineries in the United States are running at 94, 95% capacity. And having come from the commodity sector, you make all your money during the very short periods of time where things are very tight. And so the refiners are printing cash right now. Now, who's to blame? That's the price, by the way. And there's a diesel shortage in the East Coast. And Biden is contemplating an export ban. All the sort of stupid things that uneducated governments do in the time of shortages is whatever they can do to make it worse, they'll try it. And but what's a refiner to do? They're running their machines hard. Most of the time, they don't make much money. The government, it makes it impossible for them to bring on new supply. And in fact, a major refinery was shut down this year because of permitting issues in the US. And so we have this group of leaders who think that baking a cake is easy. The ingredients, immaculate, that they just appear, and the cake bakes itself, as though multiple billions of dollars that it takes to build a refinery and years of permitting that the government puts in their way in order to get it done. And then the risk that the government will tax you with excess profits in the very moments where you're actually returning your cost of capital to the risk investors who supported your project from the beginning. Why would anybody in their right mind put any money towards investing in those in any part of the industry, let alone the critical bottlenecks that are manifesting now around the world? So, for example, would it make sense for the European government to put a cap on the daily LNG carrier fees that the owners of these very complicated billion-dollar ships are charging? No, because then they'll just stop coming to Europe. That's the market price. You have to pay it. Commodities are highly inelastic. Sorry if you didn't know that. And if you punish the very people you need in the moments where you need them the most, the next time they're not going to be there. It's just that simple, So who in their right mind would try to build a refinery in the United States today, even at these sort of obscene profits? Nobody. It's not going to get done. Sierra and Greenpeace and the Environmental Defense Fund and the rest of the clowns of the professional environmental movement will do everything in their power to make it impossible for you to succeed in building it. And in the unlikely event you get it done, they will do everything in their power to take all the profits that you would generate for the risk that you took in doing so. It's ass backwards. It's totally predictable. It's consistent. History is undefeated in this regard. Governments do all the worst things during a crisis, and they only make it worse. And the analogy we used in one of our pieces and in a Twitter thread, let's just talk through this one because it's interesting, right? A hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, okay, and powers out for wide swaths of the coastal regions in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, what happens in such circumstances is the price of the things you need, if the government didn't interfere, would skyrocket. So let's just take generators. The power's out, you want a generator. Keep your fridge going, charge your phones. The price of generators in such circumstances should be allowed to double or triple or quadruple or even go up by a factor of 10. Why? If that happens, everybody with a generator within 1,000 square miles is going to put it in their truck, drive it down to the region that's impacted, and try to sell it for that money. Because I could buy it in northern Mississippi for $300, and if I could sell it on the coast of Mississippi for $1,400, and it cost me $50 in gas to do it, I'm doing it all day long. So the supply shortage would be cured much more rapidly if we allow the price of generators to go higher. But instead, governments will literally put you in jail for price gouging. They will keep the price of generators near the, quote, national retail price, and no incremental generators will go to the region, which exacerbates the shortage, exacerbates the suffering. Yes, there will be wealthy people who could buy those generators, but in so doing, they will bring in new supply. The price of the equilibrium price of generators will be quickly hit. And most people will get a generator. More people will get a generator than would have otherwise. And so it's just classic sort of feel-good politics as opposed to sensible economics. And that exact mindset is what's going on right now with these warnings about excess profits. If the people you need the most cannot make profits to do the thing you need them to do the most, why would they do it? It's not a charity. So have fun staying cold.
Yeah, and at the same time, if you want them to invest in this new technology that you think will be, which is required in the future, they need to actually make money to invest in that, which is the main issue. And I guess if we look at the complexities behind refining, because from my understanding, that's really where the bottleneck has been, as you said. And you mentioned there something that I didn't know for quite a while, that there's actually depending on where the oil is from, it affects, I guess, I'm not sure the weight or sort of how it's actually refined. So you actually have to change the whole refining system to get oil from other parts. So I think there was an example in Europe where they used to get it obviously from Russia, and now they're getting it from the Middle East, which is a different type of oil, so it requires different refining. And that's another challenge. It's just not one crude for the other. You actually have to adapt it, which I feel like sometimes people just they think it's so simple to do.
So if you actually just Google oil refinery and look at images, you'll see that these are among the most complex chemical facilities in the world. They require hundreds of engineers to operate, tens of thousands of people to build. And oil, of course, is quoted as a price, right? The price of oil. Well, there's actually hundreds of prices of oil because there's hundreds of grades of oil. And every field, in a way, is unique to a degree. And so certain regions that tap sort of similar geological formations have relative similarities between their oil. But if you have a barrel of oil coming to your refinery, well, that's actually a very complex soup of chemicals. And the distribution and composition of that soup matters. And the refining complex in the United States was built at a time when the sort of marginal barrel of oil, the production of oil in the US was on the decline. Venezuela, which actually has the largest, I believe, the largest oil reserves in the world, produce a very heavy grade of oil, as did the Canadian tar sands, which is being imported to the United States. And so it made sense at that time to build out our refineries. Now, look, for a price, you can flexibilize your refineries. You could add capabilities to handle multiple grades. And by the way, if there's a sufficiently large price arbitrage in the market between those grades, it might make sense for refiners to do that. These are all sort of nuances well below the surface of the quoted price of WTI that you see in the news. Ultimately, the very first thing you have to do as an analyst when you're looking at a quote price that you're seeing on your Bloomberg terminal is ask yourself a couple of questions about it, like how important is this price to the market? Like how many actual producers and consumers are negotiating contracts with this benchmark as a reference point? Or in some cases, is this benchmark more a financial instrument for speculation as opposed to an important benchmark for the industry? So for example, does the contract settle for delivery, or can you settle with just cash? Those commodities are unique in their own way, and they have their own histories, and they have their own sort of traditions and so on. And so when you just see the price of oil, you have to remember that oil coming from Saudi Arabia is different than oil coming from Venezuela, which is different than oil coming from the shale patch, which is different than oil coming from Canada. And the refineries, they sort of use these benchmarks to transact with the producers. But in reality, you can have very, very big dislocations within the markets, the granular markets that actually represent how things get done in the industry.
Yeah, and you could say the reason that there doesn't have that adaptability is because generally markets are pretty efficient in terms of the geography of energy. As you mentioned there, the US has basically got the US, Canada, Venezuela that can probably provide for most of America. Mexico, yeah, exactly. The Gulf. Europe's got Russia as well as sort of North Sea and parts of, I guess you could say, the Middle East, and then Asia's also got the Middle East there as well. So traditionally,
and
it's
Australia.
Australia. So traditionally, it's very efficient, but the challenge is the political issues that come into play, and especially now, it seems like there's so many barriers that actually prevents this.
So that's a very deep philosophical concept, which is what drives market efficiencies. So per our discussion today, natural gas is a highly inefficient market, whereas coal is a pretty efficient market because coal is easy to ship around, right? It's cheap to ship around. It's a solid. You literally have like sort of the lowest technology barges can handle a ton of coal, and it's all very well worked out. The different grades, the BTUs, et cetera, et cetera. So coal is relatively efficient. Oil is also relatively easy to move around over the water. And so there are sort of regional differences in the grades and so on. But by and large, there's a tight spread between, say, WTI and Brent. But over time, arbitrage forces efficiencies in the market. And we have speculated in a recent Twitter thread that post-crisis, because this crisis will end like every other crisis, we expect the world will emerge with a much more efficient natural gas market. It makes no sense that natural gas could trade for 30 cents a million BTU in Western Texas, while it's trading for $30 per million BTU month-ahead contract in the Netherlands. In the end, arbitrage will drive these things to be more efficient. LNG terminals will be built, more carriers will be built, more pipelines will be built. The market demands it, and it will eventually happen. Now, it might take 10 years. But what does the world look like with a highly efficient natural gas market? It's an interesting question. It's hard to model. Oil is more efficient, but at the same time, you see these little inefficiencies and refining bottlenecks and pinch points show up and things like that, which makes, of course, you never run out of things to write about at Doomberg, which is in a way is great and very interesting for discussions. But the thing that's shocked us throughout this whole thing is the complete lack of industrial knowledge on the part of our political class. The Biden administration has no idea what it's doing. You go through all of the possibilities, conspiracies and, World Economic Forum, Great Reset, and pick your, ultimately, incompetence explains almost all of the variants that we see. And just reading the sort of behind the scenes expose this week in the New York Times about the breakdown of the Saudi-US relationship, we're just naive, like we're silly. The Saudis live, eat, breathe, sleep oil. They know what Biden is doing with the SPR. They understand he's playing poker with his cards face down. And I don't think, I honestly believe Joe Biden is patriotic and wants the country to do well. I just don't think he knows what he's doing. And ultimately, that's perhaps a consequence of the fact that nobody with any talent wants to go into government, or at least nobody with any talent and ethics. Lots of unethical people with talent want to go into government to get their piece of the grift. But if you're a talented person with a sense of decency, government is the last place you want to be. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that we have this still bottoms of grifters and incompetence populating our governments. The Biden administration has no idea what it's doing when it comes to energy, period.
Yeah, I guess you just have to look at the UK and what we've experienced with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, and why would anyone put themselves, if they're competent, why would you put yourselves in the front line for to experience that? And basically, it's going to be very hard for them to have careers in the future. So that's a challenge. And as you said, it only attracts the either incompetent and they think they're doing good, but they're not actually, or the grifters, basically. Yeah. Yeah. So if we maybe go to something more positive, I know last time we met, we talked about nuclear and the potential that it has, and obviously that we should be investing in it now to hope to create energy security. You mentioned something before about how in parts of the US, there's lots of lawsuits preventing sort of pipeline creation. I can imagine that nuclear would have the same issues because of some preconceptions that people have about it. And I know you've sort of written an article recently, I think, about nuclear waste, but also about why those preconceptions are wrong and why it really we shouldn't think about that. So I'm not sure if you can maybe talk more about that and why. Yeah.
Yeah. So we wrote a piece just published this morning, actually. Thank you for being a loyal reader of Doomberg, called Angels on a Pin, where we, finally tackle this nonsense about nuclear waste being an issue. There are no solutions in life. There are only trade-offs. And compared to the trade-offs of all other fuels, including carbon emissions, the relatively minor nuisance of nuclear waste is truly a nothing burger, blown wildly out of proportion by the opponents of nuclear energy, who are ultimately anti-human Malthusians who don't believe most of the world deserves cheap energy and would prefer a planet where they don't exist. And we're not in that camp. We believe that all humans on this planet have a right to flourish, and energy is the ultimate source of a higher standard of living, and all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. And who are we, the arrogant ones in the West, to assume that those in the developing regions are not entitled to the same lifestyle that we have? Yes, there's things we need to do to mitigate our impact on the planet, and they're sensible, and we should do them. There is no path to decarbonization that does not go through nuclear power, period. If you're willing to collapse the standard of living for billions of people on the planet, maybe you could do it. But good luck surviving it. The guillotine will be hauled out quite quickly. And so we've often said if nuclear power were invented today, it would be hailed as a civilization-saving technology that we should implement post-haste. Instead, it has been maligned unfairly. Industry has done a terrible job of defending itself. Environmentalists concoct all manner of lies, because that's what they are, overt, knowing lies, to try to impede the development and deployment of nuclear power. And we should call bullshit on that, and we should point it out. The Doomberg team and many of our friends, including, Chris Kiefer, Canadians for Nuclear Power, and Michael Schellenberger, and Mark Nelson, and the rest of the sort of pro-nuclear, pro-uranium group, are fighting a bit of a guerrilla war on Twitter, using the modern tools of social media to have a disproportionate impact. Sun Tzu would approve, and we're going to keep doing that. And so we wrote a piece called Green Shoots of Logic, where we pointed out on a positive note, which is probably how we want to end this appearance on your show, that even the most progressive sort of environmentally oriented leaders in the US and in the West are beginning to see the fallacy of attacking nuclear power while also attacking fossil fuels, because then what are you left with? You're left with poverty, you're left with social unrest, you're left with riots and starvation, and no politician with any sense wants to be pro-starvation. So since we've started Doomberg, and others have worked as well, Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California has won a reprieve. Palisades nuclear power plant looks like it might be turned back on in Michigan. Kiefer and team up in Canada saved one of the reactors at the Pickering nuclear power plant. Germany has extended the life of its 3 remaining nuclear reactors. Even your new prime minister, in his opening speech, said, yes, nuclear needs to be part of the solution. And by the way, if you want proof of what's going to work, look no further than the Chinese. Watch what they do, not what they say. They own the renewable supply chain, and yet they have 150 nuclear reactors on the board for planning and construction, and 50 of them are being built as we speak. And so same thing with India, by the way. First nuclear power plant to be built in Poland here coming up. Looks like Westinghouse recently won the contract. I think most sensible environmentalists who are also decent and not psychopathic and empathetic to the plight of humans on this planet will eventually come to the senses and say, nuclear power is abundant, cheap, carbon-free energy for all, and nuclear waste as an issue as a canard. And the science has been solved. This is not a technology problem. It is a political problem, first and foremost, and then secondly, a financial problem where we have to make some investments. But as much money as these governments are printing and wasting all around the world, you can't tell me that there isn't a higher, the energy payback period on nuclear power, the stability of its capacity factor, its ability to be the anchor of grids around the world. You could make hydrogen from it. We could power vehicles from it. We could create a bunch of industrial heat from it. We will always have a need for fossil fuels, especially on the material side, on the chemical side, on the fertilizer side. But nuclear power can displace an awful lot of our carbon footprint while simultaneously lifting people out of poverty. And that's a win-win we're ready to fight for. And hopefully some of your listeners today, we maybe change an opinion or two, and they can join the team as well.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, I guess you could say that's one benefit out of the last year in terms of the energy crisis, that I feel like there is people finally understanding that this is a part of the solution and it needs to be a big part. I'm not sure if they know that yet, but hopefully they come to that realization in the future.
One person at a time, my friend. One person at a time.
Yeah, I'm sure you experienced that more than me. So, Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today. And I guess, is that the message you want to leave people with, or is there another message you'd like to leave people with from our interview?
The message I'd like to leave people with is head over to doomberg.substack.com and sign up today for the #1 finance Substack on earth, both literally and figuratively. Since we last talked, we did take over the top spot on the finance leaderboard for Substack, which is amazing and humbling, and something we're very proud of, an accomplishment that nobody will ever be able to take away from us, even if we're eventually dethroned, which we fully expect. But we did it. We did it through hard work and through passion and through um, fun and doing what we believe in, and talking to great content creators like yourself along the way. And so, yeah, we are 100% subscriber supported. We take no ads and accept no sponsorships. There's nothing wrong with those models, but given the provocative nature of some of our pieces, we felt having 100% editorial control over what we write was critical to our brand and to our mission. And we're overwhelmed by the support of the thousands of subscribers that we have. And as I said at the beginning, always happy to chat with you, Anthony. It was great last time, even better this time, and looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, so am I. So congratulations on becoming number one. It's definitely well deserved. Just the content you provide I think it's just another level, even compared to the massive mainstream beasts that we look at that spend billions of dollars a year. So congratulations on that. I'm a massive supporter, and yeah, definitely looking forward to doing this again in the future. I would say your Twitter as well is a great place for people to find your work, which is free. And then from there, once they realize how valuable it is, I'm sure they'll go to the Substack as well. So, Doomberg, thanks again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.